how many projects are on budget, on time, and on benefits or better, 1 in 250 or so. A well set up project is not a guarantee for success, but a badly set up project is a guarantee for failure. Later, maybe the new oil spill, right? Is a mess that is really hard to clean up, and how much is that costing? So, in all of the kind of the thing where we're pushing forward with AI is kind of a real interesting question of, is there this massive oil spill that we need to clean up first before we can really tap into these tools?
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Project Flux podcast. And today we are delighted to have Alexander Budzier from the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. He's a fellow in management practice and the director at Oxford Global Projects. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And being a member of the task force, we had so many people saying, you've got to get Alex on the show. You've got to get Alex on the show. You're very well renowned in the industry, and you've written a lot of publications, both in terms of research and books. And we'll come on to your book a bit later on the subject. And we're really going to focus on some of the pitfalls within project management and how AI can potentially help that in the future. But before we go there, Alex, can we just sort of start with you? Your work predominantly focuses on why projects fail. And we know about some of the terrible stats around projects, but around the world, really. It's not just the UK, is it? It's around the world. But what first kind of drew you to that, to studying project management at that level?
Well, now I have to think back a long time, and it's kind of the second job I got was I worked in consulting, and my job was to rescue failed IT projects, and I discovered and then did a couple of those, and then I was involved in the planning of another massive IT transformation, or digital transformation as we call them today. I was shocked at the state of how we are planning and preparing these projects up front. And I was thinking about it, there must be better ways. IT projects, the ones that I was involved with was all banking IT and insurance IT in those kind of fields. And, if you had 6 months to plan something, that was amazing. I mean, of course, it took them about 2 years to actually say, yes, we will do this. But there was so little to go with, and so little data out there. So I was really interested in, how can we improve that? And there was nothing in IT, back in that day. I don't know if anybody remembers that function points was kind of the best thing that was there, and the great work. I mean, it's good work, but applying that was really, really difficult. And so I started to look around together with some colleagues into where could there be better ideas out there. And I was looking into other sectors, say, for instance, how they do it in civil engineering or transportation infrastructure, those kind of projects, and came across these workings and some books by this little known professor from Denmark, Bent Flyvbjerg. And
we know Ben.
Back then there was a thing called Mega Projects and Risk, and he had written a thing in the Project Management Journal about what we could learn from how we can bring Nobel Prize winning insights into project management. I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I wonder whether we can do that for IT. And then I was that led to collaboration with Bent, and we both ended up here at Oxford University. And I started to do that as a PhD because I found that really fascinating to look into different practices and their outcomes across different sectors. So with the whole thing, the big idea was, if you don't set the project up for success, failure is definitely guaranteed. But if you set it up for success, success is not guaranteed, but if you don't, then failure is definitely guaranteed. So what can we do, particularly in the front end? Because at that point in time, so this is in the thousands, there was a lot of stuff and thinking that had been done generally on projects, and mostly about how do we deliver them better? sort of this whole idea that a project starts, I did my PMP exam and those kind of things. And always, you are a certified project manager now, and, the job starts with somebody handing you the charter.
Yes.
And the charter,
Over to you.
How much budget you have and when the deadline is and what you need to do. And your job is just to do that. And I thought, well, it's not actually quite true, right? We have to set the budgets. We have a massive amount of say about the timelines, what we actually need to do. We need to co-create these plans. So therefore, kind of really shifting the question to what can we do before somebody pours concrete or writes code? What do we do before to give the project a better chances of success? And I found that really, really fascinating. So that was the beginning of the journey to look into, my background. I know what's happening in IT, but, looking into what actually is the outcome of that. Can we make that measurable? Can we do better methods? Can we see better methods elsewhere? So we looked into, classics, oil and gas and energy and transportation and the Olympic Games and so on. And out of that came sort of now, almost 20 years later, a real, interesting body of insight about what's working, what's not working in between the sectors, but also very often, very specifically, what we see is sort of interesting pockets of excellence in some projects, and some projects did particularly well, no matter.
There is hope. While some,
the statistics, stuff happens, but also the statistics show the so-called rate that we always say is in how many projects are on budget, on time, and on benefits or better. Sort of 1 in 250.
1 in 200. This is appalling stat. So, that's the one I roll out all the time.
I know, but at least there's 1 in 200.
Yeah. There's one exactly. That is definitely a glass half full attitude. Because Ben came, he was looking more at construction and infrastructure projects, and you came from the IT side. What were the similarities you saw, and what were the differences perhaps between the two industries?
Well, at first I was thinking, oh God, look, civil engineering or transportation, right? They do it so much better. They have so much time to plan. And if you look around, typically you find projects that are currently being discussed and that are proposed at the moment. You find this project has been first proposed in the 1970s. Ever since we finished High Speed 1, we've been talking about doing another one.
Yeah.
Ever since, the last nuclear power station went online, we've been talking about doing the next one. So there's kind of seemingly long periods where you can really prepare what you're going to do, and the design and the planning, and don't forget good cost estimates and good schedule estimates and so on. And that, that was my initial idea, the world is so much better out there rather than in IT, where everybody just like, no, we're going to do agile now. That means prototype. Come on, show me the thing, right? So don't bother with budgeting, just like
dive in,
start going, right? And so I thought, maybe we can bring some of that discipline of the front end and kind of stage-gated decision making, sort of kind of clear delineation of pre-feasibility, feasibility, planning, etc. Sort of that kind of logic into the IT world. But then, more quickly discovered is that, in construction industry, the rate of success isn't any greater than it's in the IT industry.
It's probably just as bad.
That was that. So I had to actually change the topic of my PhD a little.
Interesting. So you had to pivot just because it wasn't what you thought it was going to be. And I think it's the natural human tendency to overestimate. And that's the focus of your book that's just recently come out, The Intelligence Trap, which kind of basically said it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. We all have this tenderness to overestimate the good side and downplay the bad side. It's just natural, isn't it? And so do you think things like artificial intelligence and the tech that's coming down the line is going to help in any respect? Or do you think there's always going to be a human making a decision and then in the end always being over optimistic about the potential?
Well, sort of what we see and what we've always championed over the years now is that we need to bring in that kind of data. So we need to learn from other projects that have come before us. And we know that, and that's the latest article, the uniqueness trap, out now in HBR.
Yeah. It'll be on the show notes for anyone who wants to read it.
That sort of what we see there is very specific to when we ask in this case, so of the people that we studied for that particular paper is we looked at IT project managers. And when the people involved in leading an IT project, so that's kind of the client team, but also the vendors, if they say your project is unique, that means actually there's a 40% chance of the project doubling its budget or having even a higher cost overrun. So it turns into an outlier, an extreme value in a portfolio of projects. So we found that is, yeah.
Why is that? Is that a self-fulfilling prophecy, or is that just naturally what happens?
Well, only a few projects said that. Not a small number, but only a few projects.
Okay.
So it's in the norm. So it's kind of like this. We looked at 1,000, 6,000 or so IT projects and sort of did the deep dive on about, I think, 250 or so of those. And we did see that sort of the majority, so about 80% actually didn't say that, some elements of uniqueness, but not completely unique, or even sort of more like, oh yeah, we have done this before, And I think isn't sort of the underlying reason why that is that sometimes, with the big IT projects and the big digital transformations, what's happening is that if you're working in an organization, you do them only ever so often. So despite what we always think, is probably another wrong assumption is, we always assume that, we're going to replace IT systems much faster than we actually do.
So Alex, just on that then, because with technology and IT projects, because the landscape progresses and it advances and it changes all the time, if there is this lag in terms of when you start one project and then you start another, are the lessons you have to learn in between much more considerable? And do you think that kind of impacts the delivery of that project?
Yeah, exactly that, right? If you think about it, and what's the average tenure in a job in IT these days? About 3 to 4 years. So if you then actually, if you're doing a project in an organization and say, okay, cool application, say, of AI at the moment, right, would be customer relationships and customer relationship management, right? Chatbots and that kind of stuff is a pretty solid use case for AI. And then you think okay, who is left in the organization who has implemented last time our CRM system? And then you go around and say, I can't find anybody anymore. They've all moved on. And, maybe that was 10 years ago because we don't constantly refresh that kind of technology. And therefore, very often you then might think, actually, my project is very unique because, there's nobody left who actually had implemented the original system.
And that's so true. And you end up with that technical debt that you've got to work through as well. And there's the old human way of kicking things under the carpet, isn't there? Okay, it's not my problem. We're not dealing with that now. And then all of a sudden you've got a new project and someone's got to unpick all of that technical debt that you've let mount up over a decade or whatever.
I know. And then, sort of one of the things I think in the book that also just came out, Intelligent Change, where we looked at digital transformations, in the book, we start off with the beautiful example of the Queensland payroll system, which was a very spectacularly challenged project. And one of the root causes there was, they built this new payroll system initially for all people paid by the public sector in Queensland. And once they realized that is a bit too much to chew, they just sort of shrunk it down to let's just do it for the healthcare sector. And Queensland is a mixed system, so it's public and private, which, the business logic isn't easy, etc., etc. They started this project and it became infamous because it created so many errors. But those were actually not errors created by the system. There was errors there that were in the old system.
In the data and in the...
Yeah, exactly. So in the peak, they then had to use, I think it was almost 2,000 people to reconcile calculations by the system, how much people should get paid, and then to actually figure out how much they should, should be really paid. And to this day, there is about 900 people working in that function to reconcile monthly payments.
Wow, how long has that been going on for?
10 years, more than that, right? It's crazy, right? And that's kind of the tech debt, everybody knew the old system wasn't working, but nobody really wanted to talk about it because some people were overpaid and that asks uncomfortable questions. So, and then we basically get a big implementation partner on board and says, we want a like-for-like replacement, and then scale it up. Guess what you get? You get a scale up of error and then had a massive cleanup bill. afterwards. That's, and probably a lot of that kind of knowledge of what was wrong with the old system had long left the door, nobody really
Yeah, yeah,
wanted to kick the can on that. And so that's to your point, right? So that is then the legacy, the baggage a lot of people carry around with them. That's kind of like, do we really understand that? And is there anybody in the organization who really has the knowledge? All those skeletons are hidden in the different closets. And I think that's really interesting because now when we're looking at a lot of AI things and cool AI tool chains and so on, right? Particularly in the startup world, there's great tools out there. But then you start thinking about this, and how do I apply that in the corporate environment with the legacy, with the frameworks, with the architecture that is in place, and can I actually fit that tool into our setup, into our policies, into what we need to do that. And the second thing around this is, of course, a lot of that relies on data. And so, there's, well, I still have to find any single system, where people would blindly swear that the data in there is all correct and nobody has ever entered something erroneously or that kind of stuff.
No, that's what I was going to say. I mean, it's you raised that example, but I bet you that's not unique. And to some extent, I think every system's got that, even if it's like just one or two errors. You have to. People talk about data being the new oil and feeding these AI systems, but there is also a danger that the data is wrong in the first place. So how much can you rely on the data?
But yeah, exactly.
Just
and I always think about this, sort of the flip side to frame that would be then to think about this, is data maybe the new oil spill, right? This mess that is really hard to clean up, and how much is that costing? So, in all of the kind of the thing where we're pushing forward with AI is kind of a real interesting question of, is there this massive oil spill that we need to clean up first before we can really tap into these tools?
But Alex, but do you think so you mentioned that there's this time between the delivery of projects, and you refer to the fact that, are some of the people who delivered the first project then going to be available when you deliver the second project because of that time gap? So there's a challenge of preservation, right? Preserving that knowledge that was delivered in the first project in the second. Do you see there to be any utility for using AI in bridging or preserving that intelligence?
And one of the things, what AI is really good at is finding stuff at the moment where we're at. So at this point in time, right, having something that is really good at discovering things if you had, but that if you had all the contemporaneous notes and, the documentation and the code as well documented and people have actually written down what happened, then AI is really, really good at accessing that kind of information and help finding that information, making that discoverable. So that obviously would then require that people have written this down. So I think it's where this could really work is when we're thinking about, in some big construction projects, we're thinking about learning legacies. So here in the UK, I think the 2012 Olympics were the first people, but then you look at the learning legacy and it's more like glossy marketing brochures, and then the next big push was made by Crossrail, and that started off as sort of also a glorified learning library. And, latterly it has become a bit more honest and, and saying, here's some stuff that we actually got wrong. Now almost every of the big projects is keeping notes around what have we learned from projects and what are we learning, and we're getting much better at that. So if you look at, the HS2 thing, they actually write it as they go along. And, obviously nobody needs to pretend that HS2 has been a glowing success. So there's definitely, some pitfalls that can be avoid this in the future of moments that are documented. So that's, I think, something as an organization, right? If you have that kind of pool of knowledge somewhere, that in whatever shape or form, that is kind of a real interesting thing to tap into. And AI can definitely help discover that stuff. I think that is something. The other elements of this is that what I always think about is what's also really hard on project, in whether it's IT or whether it's construction, is things like compliance and regulation.
Yeah.
if you have a classic, even if you look in some of the construction contracts, right, there's like 15,000 clauses in there about us. No, and here's all the regulations that are given in the country to build a thing like that. And then we have extra regulations, because we're a good owner and client. And same thing in IT, right? I worked in banking before, tons of regulation around stuff. So, and a lot of that is, you kind of need to identify and find specific things, that relate to, whatever you're designing when you're ever thinking about doing a proof of concept or finding a solution, that big question, but is this compliant? Or, if we submit this proposal, how to do this to the regulator, are we likely to get approval on this? And again, sort of, I think that's again sort of one of those use cases of finding, sorting, and distilling information that AI is pretty good at.
Yeah. But what we've got to get better at, I suppose, is there is the data out there, but we're not very good at sharing it, are we, within the industry? So to make the full use of these AI features, it would be great if we actually started being a little bit more transparent between us with our data, because there's no inherent value in it on its own. So where companies kind of hoard data, I've always seen it as it's not really benefiting them and it's not benefiting the industry as a whole. Is that a fair statement, or do you think we're actually pretty good at sharing data and
No, we're
sharing
not particularly good at sharing data, but I think also, there's of course commercial sensitivities around these things, and as you say, right, if the thinking is that data is the new oil, and the companies, well, there's the companies that produce data or high quality oil, those will definitely have a great benefits and economics case for them, and then is the exploitation of that data, is that, good thing? And, I collected my own data on projects for research and other purposes. And sometimes it is quite hard for organizations to share the data. And typically, particularly around projects, and everybody knows they're not going very well. But nobody wants to really tell that openly, because it will definitely, it might impact the share price.
I remember talking to Bent actually a few years ago, and he said that in Denmark they've got some kind of data trust in place where they're encouraged to share the data between projects. So I think there's some pockets around the world where they do better than others.
Yeah, I think so too. And that was public sector, and that was for the big IT projects, right? And you think about this and sort of that here in the UK, the Major Projects Authority, and what's now the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and soon will be NISTA.
Yeah.
That they have started creating some similar data sets that can be shared between projects within government, but even similar things apply there, right? Because, even when we're thinking about the public sector, right, you don't have a share price to worry about. You get angry press, and here in the UK, you end up in front of the Public Accounts Committee or something like that. That's the worst that can happen, which is pretty bad, but, and that is, in the public sector, so they should be able to share the data. But then at the flip side, also the public sector is heavily in competition with each other.
Yes, that's true. I was surprised just how much, actually. There was a talk I went to not long ago where I found out that it takes for one department to another in the UK government to get data can take 3 months just to go from one department to another. And I thought, in my naive style, thought that, being all government, they would freely be able to share data between each other, but that's not the case at all.
No, not what I can see. Yes, my personal experience neither. And, it's a kind of the same story almost, is like everybody is always fighting for more budget and to do more projects, because everybody has a list longer of the stuff they want to do than they can actually get funding for from the treasury, right? So therefore, there's equally, like in the private sector, that incentive of, hiding a little bit the bad news. You don't want to be the department that looks like they're constantly squandering the money, or looks bad in project delivery, and therefore you
saving face, isn't it?
Kind of the same thing, and similarly, competitive pressures like you would see is in sort of, when you go and see sort of a beauty show of vendors, they never want to tell you how badly the last couple of projects went. They're obviously selling on the success rather than on the
Yeah, exactly. Can I ask, is in your experience, are things getting better, or are we just as bad as it's always been? Because I remember coming into the industry in 1999, and we're talking about the exact same things now as we were then, even though we've got better technology and we've got AI. We seem to still be struggling with some of the same issues. So are we just bad at learning from the past, or is there something structurally wrong with how we run projects?
I mean, for a long time, we've always been focusing on sort of the delivery side of things. And where I actually see things moving on is to think really more about what we can do in the front end of projects. And that is a journey that long predates all of us, particularly sort of in the oil and gas industry, sort of the forefront of really thinking things through, getting a lot of discipline around this. And so now I see is that slowly, I mean, it moves at glacial pace here, that we're talking about these same things, you know, sort of as an approaches to better risk sharing, more collaboration, you know, that we are starting to actually, you know, see better practices going through, and that we're seeing more of those happening than before. My proof point of this is, you know, the first big partnering job in the UK. I mean, some people will say BP has always been doing that, great, you know, but, and then the big first job outside that world was Terminal 5. Yeah. And for 20 years after, 15 years almost after, nobody has done the same. And
that was a great success. Terminal 5 was a great success. Why hasn't that been repeated as a model?
You know, so even within our airports, you know, sort of suddenly after Terminal 5 opened to great fanfare and success from a project delivery point of view, the narrative emerged, oh, it's actually more expensive. You know, it's much more, you know, the old adversarial culture of transferring all the risk into the supply chain, you know, and then squeezing the suppliers and being very aggressive, you know, that is actually cheaper per square meter. So, and that came back, you know, and that kind of narrative, basically undid that. And only now, where some things in the industry actually have structurally changed. So here in the UK, right, we always remember the Carillion collapse, and we're seeing sort of really tenders in big projects that have been struggling to place the value of that. You know, we had seen the same thing in the IT industry probably a bit earlier. Probably the big watershed moment was the National Programme for IT in the NHS. So where we suddenly start thinking about, let's not package these things up into things that are hundreds of millions or billions, and then try to transfer the risk on top of that into the private market, because people will go bankrupt. Like Carillion did, you know, and other people who didn't want to tell it. Well, you know, some other people like Accenture or Fujitsu who dropped out of NP-FIT and rather paid hundreds of millions in break clauses to just get away from that thing.
Crazy.
You know, and you know, that was kind of, I think, is in sort of fundamental moments where each of these industry had to think about as, we need to do something different.
Well, you're right. It was a profound, you know, the Carillion collapse in particular had a profound impact, because it almost took us back, I think, sort of 15, 20 years in terms of culture. We were starting to all work a bit more together. And I think that just made it very apparent that when the chips come down, it's everyone for themselves in the industry. So so basically what you're saying, it's getting better, but very slowly. But that brings us nicely, I think, to, I just want to talk about AI. So firstly, let me ask you how it feels to us on this podcast that we're at the precipice of quite a monumental shift in AI that's going to be akin to at least the internet, if not electricity and other huge advances. So how excited are you by what's happening with AI and AGI, and how much do you think it's going to impact the project delivery space?
I think it will have profound impacts. And the way I always look at it is in sort of, you know, I look at it from the side of there's some interesting productivity statistics out, and the US has very good productivity statistics for construction sector, for instance, which is always a laggard, you know, and they have data from sort of the mid 1980s. And when you look at that data, obviously nothing has happened in construction. We're as productive as we were in 1987.
Oh, that stat is crazy.
I do. But where you see a massive shift, if you look at the figures, is in sort of, and everything has been pretty flat, apart from for one big thing, and that is white collar job productivity in construction. Because between 1987 and sort of the first 5 years, sort of to mid 1990s, 1992 to 1995, the productivity of white-collar work in projects doubled. And then from that peak, it has come down. And sort of, if you look at the latest figures, it's as productive as it was in 1987 again. But that was the first big wave of computerization. And that was when we suddenly got better planning tools, laptops everywhere, and desktop computers everywhere. We had, things, like, well, I forgot actually when Primavera first came out, but definitely MS Projects and those kind of things. So suddenly,
probably 90s, wasn't it? Late 1990s.
Yeah, so Microplanner was still around, and that was kind of, old planning software. Suddenly, everybody could do that, and it was much easier to do that. And that led a massive amount of explosion of productivity. So I think as now we're thinking really about tools and tool chaining again, and also thinking about how we can do things differently. So I think particular generative design space, AI for generative planning is sort of probably nascent, but we see really interesting products emerge in that space that are actually working and have a positive business case with generative AI. Some of the stuff that I've seen around generative design of data centers and hospitals, but also highways and stuff like that is really, really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's absolutely transformative. We've used AI also in forecasting for projects and planning projects.
Yeah, I saw there was one piece of research you did about the Hong Kong government, didn't you, about using AI to predict project overruns?
We did. And so the simple answer to that is, we used a tried and tested method that now is called machine learning because it's nonlinear forecasting. So if you think about classic earned value management approach, you have your CPI and your SPI, your cost performance index and your schedule performance index. And if you use those for forecasting, because you have that index, it's like the slope for forecast. You just ram a straight line at the SPI or CPI slope through your project. But projects are not linear. Sort of typically they actually follow some sort of S curve. There's a bit of optimization, and then they're actually linear in the middle bit where all the bulk of the work happens, and then they taper off at the end again. So what we did was the simple thing about it, and let's actually just, put together a more complex model that does nonlinear forecasting. And that's, a technology that since the 1980s, neural networks are very good at that stuff. And the only statistical solution for that, and that's part of the AI tool set these days. And then you can also add some other things in there because you can make it a bit more dynamic than sort of classic forecasting methods. Because you can take us and what has happened last month, we can put that into the forecast of this month. So you can take some of the trending information and do these kind of predictions. So, in that case, we simply use the power of AI because it does fancier statistics than ramming a straight line through something that very self-evidently is not a straight line.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting you bring that up because, the big kind of talk at the moment is all around generative AI and the chatbots, but actually you've got to separate the creative AI from the analytical AI, and the analytical AI for projects is really important, and the machine that's getting better as well. So even though, it's the buzz, isn't it, is around ChatGPT, there's a lot more to be excited around in project delivery.
Yes, and exactly. And I think it's sort of what we know is what, if you think about is what has AI actually contributed, right? So AI has some really good statistical models that are advanced statistics, that go way beyond Excel. So if you have to think about a complex analytical task, AI is good at that. AI is very good at finding data because it can extract concepts and topics. So you don't have to search by keyword and have to hope that in pages and pages and pages of staff documentation regulation, everybody uses exactly the same terms. So AI is very good at dealing with that kind of ambiguity. So that helps at the finding and discoverability of things and sorting things of data that's already there. And the other good thing that ChatGPT and what's happening now, what AI is pretty good at, is understanding the user input. So that we suddenly can actually tap into these other fields through natural language interfaces. So you don't have to speak SQ to actually triangulate between, let's say, for planning purposes, we would really like to price a job, but the data sits in an asset management system, in a sales database, in sort of some other finance management system. And suddenly, you have to speak 3 database languages and understand 3 data structures and schemes and so on, and, to formulate what you want. So, AI is very good at doing that.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty cool. And the other thing that we've seen, or I've seen, what I'm quite excited about in the space of IT is the buzzword of this year, agentic AI.
Yeah.
And sort of really thinking, we've done sort of automated testing and no code coding, etc. before, but actually for small tasks, creating these sort of almost agents, well, sort of, if you look at
like a group of agents, isn't it? When you
it's a group of agents, right? So sort of, if you look at, say, for instance, pick one out, Amazon Q, it's a good agentic AI platform for coding, right? So you have one orchestrating agent that says, no, I think I should solve the task like this. I will develop a strategy from what I've learned. What is a good strategy to solve this problem? And then typically spins out another AI and asks the AI, write me some code to do this. And then the AI goes out and writes that code. And we know that if it has learned from good code, it's better than if it has learned from Stack Hub, because everybody posts their mistakes there. So you'll get great code out of that. So if you have a good code base, then you get better answers. But then it gets the code, hands it over to the next AI agent who does the parsing, actually sees and does a compile. If not, feed that back until we find something that compiles. And then the third one that does the automated testing. So that you just have to give the prompt, again, in natural language, which the cool thing of saying is that I need I'm doing a little bit of a web application development. I need a user identity management / login kind of process module that handles the following tasks successfully. You write that, and then you get code back that compiles, that has been tested against the requirements you specify.
So exciting, isn't it? It's amazing, really.
And that is pretty cool, and sort of, when I look at the university kind of thing, is in sort of my hat on sort of stuff that has recently emerged, like particularly the deep research AI versions,
I love it.
Get the first step of, okay, the first step is I will formulate myself a little research plan. And you get the reasoning out, why am I going to do that? And, this is what I understand from this. And, and here I see some shortcomings. So there's that kind of evaluation step built in. And I think that would be really, really exciting and interesting, where you get these kind of capabilities now that hopefully will help us again, to undo the backsliding that we did from the massive activity explosion that we got with when we first got computers to, now we can hopefully really start thinking about what is the task, what's actually value added work.
Yeah, exactly. I just hope we take advantage of it, because that's the big thing, is the technology is there, but in the industry we're quite slow at adoption. So, and that's why we do this. That's why we do the podcast and the newsletter, is to sort of help spread it and demystify it for people. But I know you had a question, Yoshi.
Yeah. So Alex, because we've just touched on the differences between analytical and then generative AI, and with agentic systems, we're leaning more towards autonomy. Right, so you're having a lot more autonomy systems or autonomous systems, which can effectively help deliver your project for you. Now, Alex, you mentioned in your intelligence change book, not intelligence change, sorry, intelligence change book, that it focuses quite heavily on relationships, and in it you kind of put a lot of emphasis on giving ownership to frontline managers. Now, because of the autonomous capabilities of the AI systems, do you think that can actually lead potentially to frontline staff becoming misers, in a sense that they rely too heavily on AI, and therefore that sense of ownership is then diminished?
Well, that's an interesting question there. And sort of there's two interesting questions I think. Is when we are thinking about AI tools and so on, right? There's proliferation now of tools for project management, and if you're getting the pitch from the vendors, they all look good and really exciting and interesting. And then you try it yourself and find, the learning curve is a bit steeper than the person who coded this thing just told me. Okay, fine. But then you often give it to the people who actually worked with. I have to work with that. Suddenly, it's not happening in the container construction site, but it's somebody who's an operative on site who has to do some entry. And that can be really challenging. So there we see, actually, when we think about AI solution, actually thinking about is yes, we found in our research, right, that transferring the ownership to the people who actually do the work is really, really important. And too often we forget who's actually doing the work. At the moment, there's a lot of clever solutions out there that have been done by very clever people, that sometimes I do wonder if I were to go with an iPad to a toolbox meeting in the morning, will we really get that kind of capability out of the solution that, once a bunch of senior engineers huddle around a computer in their container can get? It's an interesting question. And then the second thing to that is if some of the things where AI can help with that, so how do we get the buy-in of the people on the front line into these kind of solutions, and will there be misers? There's of course an element of there about sort of course, the fear of the loss of a job is always important. Sort of one of the things in the book we talk about is the trust formula. And for the very first time, we took some real data that we collected and tested, made this trust formula. And the one big thing that, trust is built, so goes the formula by credibility, reliability, and intimacy, that sort of shared understanding, psychological safety, and those kind of things. And it's destroyed by self-orientation. So if one party who wants to do the change wins and another party loses, there is very little trust. And if you go in and show somebody and say, well, this AI will make you all jobless, then there's zero trust.
Yeah.
And then, of course, people turn into misers. So that's a big thing that might happen. Therefore, it's hard to implement those kind of tools then. But then there's also the question of what is the job we need to do, because we still need to do jobs. And I always find it very fascinating, because we once took a person who was the lean guru of Toyota around. And he came to visit Oxford, give a bunch of seminars, and sort of in between the seminars we show the best that Oxford has to offer. It's the mini factory up on the hill. And because it was the lean guru, all the BMW engineers were very proud to show off their factories, and so our dear visitor just walked through this and looked at it, and you see, and in the production process, hardly a person walks around, everything is robots, kind of that world, everything is clean, tidy, robotics. And only after all the BMW engineers had left, he turned around to us and said, you know what? Oh no, he asked one question. He said, but where are all the people who are trying to make this better?
What an interesting question.
No, so you might not need the people on the assembly line, but you might need a lot of people standing next to the assembly line whose job it is to make it a little bit better every single day. Right.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a big lesson there.
BMW robotic welding shop devoid of human beings. So where are the people that make it better? So the same thing, we might take some people out of the process that we're doing at the moment, but then where are the people that make it better? Because we don't just want to freeze the status quo. Coming back to our statistics that we cited earlier, right? The status quo isn't great. So if we just use tools at the moment to freeze what everybody does at the moment, then nothing will get better. So we need to...
And it's a lost opportunity, isn't it? The opportunity with this is, like you say, free the humans up to be able to come up with better ways of doing things and let the robots do the grunt work.
Yeah, exactly. And then you need kind of that row of people behind the robots to really think about it. And how can we make this better? So every single day. And that will be, I think, probably in the further future, since it doesn't move that fast in project management. But I think when we're thinking about these things, that will be sort of the future, that when we're working in project management is less about doing the work, but actually improving how the work gets done.
Well, that's exciting. That's something to look forward to. We're just about running out of time, but we always like to ask you a kind of bit more of a fun question at the end to finish up with. So if you could summarize, and I know this is a big question, but I'll do your best. If you could summarize all your work into one key lesson for people managing any kind of project, what would it be?
To summarize it is that, a well set up project is not a guarantee for success, but a badly set up project is a guarantee for failure.
Brilliant. Yeah. And that, from personal experience working on projects for 20 years, that is absolutely true. You've got to just minimize the downsides and up the upsides, right?
Yeah. And you actually have to do something about this, right? Hope is not a strategy. That's the other thing, You don't get lucky. You don't get lucky in this industry.
I think we got the podcast title there. You'll see, hope is not a strategy.
Yes, exactly. Hope is not a strategy. Luck is not a leadership quality, and
Very good. And I have to say, I'm halfway through your book at the moment, and it's
Well,
really
that's good.
compelling grilled. And I would just encourage everyone to get hold of a copy. Where can people get it from? Presumably from the normal places, Amazon and bookshops
Yeah,
everywhere?
absolutely. From the normal places, all your bookshops. It's been published by Wiley, so it's widely available. Amazon will sort you out, or any other book chain, of course. Yeah, exactly. It's called Intelligent Change: The Science Behind Digital Transformation. May it be AI or any other tool, because it all boils down to how we manage humans, and we're looking at the how and what works and what doesn't. The other thing that's out this month in Harvard Business Review is all about uniqueness, so falling into the uniqueness trap. So what is that uniqueness trap, and how can we avoid that?
Fantastic. Well, we'll put both those links in the show notes, and a link to your LinkedIn, because you're quite vocal on there, and to Oxford Global Projects. And Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. We hope that you'll come back maybe in a year or so to see how things have progressed. Let's see if things have improved any faster than they have been over the last 20 years. But all we can say, thank you so much for your time.
That will be exciting. And in October, we've got another book coming out called How to Measure Anything in Project Management.
Oh, I like the sound of that one.
Because it will be way more nerdy than the others, but it's all about, it's a manifesto to make things more measurable and less red, amber, green, or, maybe this, then that, So how can we make better decisions by actually measuring stuff in a better way?
Yeah, there was a great book by, I can't remember his name, but it was Measure What Matters. That was the blueprint for OKRs, and that Google and IBM use. And I read that. That was a game changer for me.
And so, exactly. So, yes, John Doerr's Measure What Matters.
That's it, yeah.
Good one, yeah. And so, but this is also getting into the hard things, and how do you measure benefits, right? Thinking about stuff that at the moment everybody says, we don't do that because polluting the environment is so much cheaper than, because how can you quantify biodiversity values, or how can you quantify the social value, and therefore you end up making suboptimal decisions. So there's some really, anyway.
Well, maybe we can get you back on around October time then, so we could talk about your new book. I look forward to that.
Just an idea.
Fantastic.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Exactly. Looking forward to the episode.
Project Flux is here.
That's a wrap for today's episode. But before you go, exciting news. Project Flux is teaming up with Project Management Global to bring you the latest in AI-driven project delivery and essential management insights. Through this partnership, expect weekly AI insights, practical tools, and expert thought leadership, ensuring you stay ahead in the evolving project landscape. Stay tuned for exclusive content, joint research, and strategies to supercharge your project outcomes. You can learn more at www.pm-global.co.uk and be part of the future of project management. See you later.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.